My parents called the whole family into the dining room, pointed at me across the table, and said, "We're giving her one chance to confess before we call the police. She's been draining Grandma's account for 2 years." 40 relatives turned to look at me. I set down my coffee. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't explain the folder in my bag. I only said, "Fine, but Grandma checks her own account. Right now." Out loud, in front of everyone. My father laughed. My mother stopped laughing when Grandma asked for her reading glasses. Grandma read the top page once, then again, slower. Then she stood, gripping the table, and looked at the little boy on the couch. "Take the children outside," she said. "Now, before I say the rest." For a second, nobody moved. 40 adults, and not one of them could make their legs work. My Aunt Vivian was the one who finally stood up, took Theo by the hand, and walked him toward the back door, with two of the younger cousins trailing after. Theo looked back at me once, the way children do when they can feel the temperature of a room drop but can't name why. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage. "Everything is fine. Keep walking." And he did. My name is Meredith Ansley. I'm 34 years old, and for 11 years, I've worked as an estate notary and probate specialist in Litchfield County, Connecticut. That's a fancy way of saying I spend my days with dying people's paperwork. I sit across from grandmothers and grandfathers, and I help them decide, in ink, who gets the house and who gets nothing, and then I make it legal. I witness signatures, I seal documents, I file them with the court, so that no one, years later, can stand in a dining room and rewrite the truth by shouting it louder than everyone else. I want you to remember that word. Louder. Because that's the whole strategy my parents brought to that table. They thought the loudest voice wins. They thought 40 witnesses would make an accusation into a fact. What they forgot is that I don't work in volume. I work in documents, and the woman with the reading glasses at the head of the table was about to explain to them the difference. So if you're new here, settle in, because this isn't the story of a family fight. This is the story of how a family meeting became a trial for a crime that never happened, and how the people running the trial turned out to be the ones who should have been afraid of a courtroom. Let me back up 2 years, because that's where they say it started. 2 years ago, my parents, Gordon and Priscilla Ansley, noticed something in my grandmother's bank statements. Grandma Adele is 79. She still lives in the old family house on Ridge Road, the one with the porch that wraps around, and the maple tree my great-grandfather planted. She's sharp as a tack, but she's old, and old people let their children help with the mail. So my parents had been helping, which is another way of saying they'd been reading everything that came into that house. And what they found month after month was a transfer. The same amount, the same date, going out of my grandmother's account to somewhere they couldn't see. $4,200 every month for 2 years straight. Now, if you found that and you loved your mother, you'd ask her about it. You'd sit down at her kitchen table and say, "Mom, what's this money? Who's it going to? Are you okay? Is someone pressuring you?" That's not what they did. My parents looked at a recurring transfer they didn't understand, and they decided, because it was convenient, because it was profitable, because it pointed away from themselves, that I was stealing it. Me. The daughter with access to legal documents. The daughter who knew how banks and estates worked. In their story, that knowledge wasn't a job. It was a motive. They spent 2 years building a case in whispers. 2 years of family barbecues where I'd catch my mother going quiet when I walked up. 2 years of my brother Desmond, suddenly too busy to return a call. They gathered their statements, they highlighted their numbers, and they picked their moment. The summer reunion, the one weekend a year when the whole sprawling Ansley clan comes to the house on Ridge Road. 40 people. Maximum audience. Maximum pressure. They wanted a confession in front of everyone. They wanted me to break. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, and I suspected my grandmother, was that I'd been carrying a sealed envelope in my bag for the last 2 months. I won't tell you yet what was in it. I'll only tell you that I'd notarized it myself, that a copy was already on file at the Litchfield County Probate Court, under lock and seal, and that I had been praying, quietly, for 2 years, that I would never have to open it. My parents made me open it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the table, to the moment before Grandma stood up, because you need to understand exactly how outnumbered I looked. The dining room in that house seats 12 comfortably and 30 if you don't mind elbows. That day there were 40, spilling into the hall, standing along the wallpaper, holding paper plates. My father had positioned himself at the head of the table, Grandma's chair, though she wasn't in it yet. And my mother sat at his right hand like a prosecutor's assistant. In front of them, fanned out on the tablecloth, was a stack of paper an inch thick. Bank statements, highlighted, tabbed with little colored flags. My father tapped the top page with 2 fingers. "We didn't want to do this here," he said, in the voice of a man who had wanted nothing more his entire life. "But you left us no choice, Meredith. 2 years, $4,200 a month. That's over $100,000 out of your grandmother's account, and every dollar of it went somewhere you won't explain." A murmur went around the room. $100,000 is a number that makes people gasp before they think. My Aunt Coraline should have been there to defend me. She always did. But my Aunt Coraline was dead, and the how and the why of that was a knot I hadn't finished untying, and a knot my parents were counting on staying tied. I didn't answer my father right away. I've sat across from enough grieving, furious, frightened families to know that the first thing you say in a fight like this is the thing they'll quote back at you forever. So I took my time. I reached into my bag, and I watched my mother's eyes snap to my hand, watched a flicker of something cross her face that I would only understand later, and I took out a single legal pad and a pen. Not the envelope, just a pad. "Go on," I said. "I'm taking notes." That threw them. You accuse someone of $100,000 theft, and you expect tears or rage. You don't expect a woman calmly writing down what you say like she's deposing you. My father's jaw worked. My mother leaned toward him and whispered something. "You think this is a joke," my father said. "No," I said. "I think it's a record. There's a difference." I clicked the pen. "You said the money left Grandma's account on a recurring transfer. Do you have the reference code for those transfers? The string of letters and numbers next to each one?" Here's a thing most people don't know about their own bank statements. Every automated transfer carries a reference, a code that tells you what it's for, and if it's tied to a legal instrument, links back to the file that authorized it. It's boring, nobody reads it, which is exactly why it's useful. My father flipped to a highlighted line. "It's right here, 4200, June 3rd. That's the amount and the date," I said. I asked for the reference code. Read it out loud, the whole string. He looked down at the paper, and for the first time since he'd started, my father, 61 years old, a man who ran his household like a courtroom he always won, went quiet, because the reference code was a jumble of letters he couldn't parse, and he knew The way you know the floor has dropped out from under you, that reading it aloud would connect the money to a document. And he did not know what that document said. That's not the point, he said finally. It's the whole point, I said. And I wrote, in block letters on my legal pad, so the people leaning over my shoulder could read it. He won't read the code. The room shifted. Just a little. 40 people who had walked in certain of my guilt now had one small splinter of doubt. And doubt in a crowd spreads like a crack across a windshield. And here's the thing about a crowd that size. It isn't one audience, it's 40 of them, and they don't all crack at once. My cousin Bennett, who'd driven up from Hartford, and who has never in his life passed up a chance to be on the winning side, was the first to lean forward. He's the kind of man who treats a family fight like a ball game, and he wanted to be sure he was cheering for the team that would still be standing at the end. "Just read the code, Uncle Gordon," he said, not unkindly, just curious. "If it clears everything up, read it." My father didn't look at him. That silence did more damage than any answer could have, because Bennett is loud, and Bennett noticing something means everyone downstream of Bennett notices it too. Then it was my great-uncle Walter, 91 years old, hard of hearing, sitting near the sideboard with a plate of ham he had forgotten about. He cupped a hand to his ear and said, far too loudly, the way the very old do, "What's the boy's name? The one they keep talking about the money for?" And nobody answered him either, and the not answering rippled outward, because a question no one will answer is more frightening than any accusation. I counted the faces turning. I actually counted them, in my head, the way I count witnesses at a signing. At the start of the afternoon, 40 people were looking at me like a criminal. By the time my father wouldn't read that code aloud, I could see at least a dozen of them looking at him instead. And a dozen doubters in a room of 40 is no longer a mob. It's a jury that started to deliberate. My mother felt it too. She's always been better than my father at reading a room. He wins by force. She wins by feel. She reached over, took the top statement, and held it up so everyone could see the highlighter. "You want the number?" she said. "Here's the number. $4,200, 27 times. That's more than $113,000. And it did not walk out of your grandmother's account by itself. Somebody set that up. Somebody with access. Somebody who knows exactly how to move money so it can't be traced." She let her eyes rest on me. Now, who in this family fits that description? It was a good line. I'll give her that. It was the best line either of them landed all day, because it was true in every detail and wrong in its conclusion. And those are the hardest lies to answer, the ones built entirely out of facts. Yes, someone had set it up. Yes, it took someone who knew how money and estates worked. Yes, that person was me. I had helped set every one of those transfers up. And I'd done it to protect a child, not to rob an old woman. But there was no way to say that yet without opening every other door before I was ready. So I did the only thing you can do when someone hands you a true fact wrapped around a false meaning. I agreed with the fact. "You're right," I said. "It did take someone who knows how estates work. It took someone Grandma trusted with the most private part of her life. And I'll tell all of you exactly who that was, and exactly why. But not because you shouted me into it, because the paper's going to say it whether I talk or not." I set my pen down. "Keep going, Mom. You're closer to the truth than you know. You just have the villain wrong." My mother tried to close it. "Meredith, sweetheart." The sweetheart was a weapon. She only ever used it in public. "Nobody wants to send you to jail. We're your family. Just tell everyone where the money went, and we can put this behind us. The reference code will tell everyone where the money went, I said. You're holding it. You just won't read it. Because it's gibberish, my father snapped. It's a probate file number, I said quietly. Filed under a name none of you would recognize. Would you like me to read it? And I let that sit. I didn't read it. Not yet. Because here's the thing about a room like that. You don't win it by dumping everything at once. You win it the way you tell a good story. One door at a time. And I just cracked open a door with a name behind it that 4 people in that house had spent 5 years trying to nail shut. Let me tell you about the boy on the couch. His name is Theo. He's 7 years old. He was born in June of 2019, so he just had his birthday. He has a cowlick that won't lie flat and a habit of lining his shoes up perfectly by the door, toes even, like a little soldier. When the family asked about him, my parents had a ready answer. He was the child of some distant cousin, a kid who'd landed in a rough spot, and Grandma had generously taken him in for a while. A charity case, a footnote. You know how soft-hearted your grandmother is, my mother would say, and everyone would nod, and nobody would look too closely. Nobody except me, because I knew whose eyes those were. But that afternoon, before Aunt Vivian let him out the back door, something happened that made my grandmother's hands start to shake. And it happened so fast that most of the room missed it. My father was mid-accusation, my mother was doing her wounded mother routine, and Theo, who had been sitting quietly on the couch by the window, got up. 7-year-olds don't understand grown-up trials. He just knew the adults were upset, and that upset was uncomfortable. And he wandered toward the table, the way kids do, looking for a familiar face. In his hand he was holding something, a small thing, a locket on a thin chain, the kind you'd hardly notice. I noticed, because I'd seen that locket before. It had belonged to my Aunt Coraline. Cora wore it every day of her life. It had her initials on the back and a photograph inside that she never let anyone see. And it could not, have been in the hands of a distant cousin's charity case. Theo held it up toward the table, toward all the noise, and in his high, clear voice he asked, "Is Grandma Adele upset because of Mommy?" The room didn't catch it. 40 people, most of them talking over each other. They heard a confused child say something about his mother and thought nothing of it. A distant cousin's kid, missing his mom. Sad. Move on. But my grandmother heard it, and her whole body went still, because Theo hadn't said his mommy was upset. He'd asked if Grandma Adele, his grandmother, though he didn't have the words for it, was upset because of Mommy, because of Cora, because of the daughter my grandmother had buried for real just over 2 years ago, and the sister my father had buried on paper 3 years before that. Adele moved fast, for a woman of 79. She crossed the room, knelt down in front of Theo. I heard her knees crack, and gently close a small hand around the locket. "Put that in your pocket, and keep it safe, love," she murmured. "That's yours. Don't show it to anyone but me." Then she leaned in, so close her lips almost touched his ear, and she whispered something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, Theo nodded, solemn as a judge, and slipped the locket into his pocket. I need to stop the story for a second and tell you how close we came, right there, to losing everything. Because it wasn't at the climax, hours later, that my heart nearly stopped. It was in that ordinary moment, a child crossing a room with a locket, because Bennett, loud, ball game cheering Bennett, had heard Theo too. Not the way Grandma heard it. Not all the way down to the bone, but enough. "Whose kid is that anyway?" he said, half to the room. He keeps saying, "Mommy." I thought his mom wasn't around. And my mother, who could smell danger before it had a name, turned instantly and said smooth as anything, "He's a cousin's boy, Bennett. He's had a hard time. Leave him be." She said it kindly. She said it the way you'd shoo a dog off the furniture. And that kindness was the most dangerous thing in the room, because if that story held, "A cousin's boy, no one's business, leave him be," then Theo would stay a footnote forever. And a footnote can't inherit. And a footnote can be moved to another state some quiet Tuesday and never seen again. I watched my grandmother make a decision in the space of about 2 seconds. I saw her weigh telling the whole room right then, and I saw her decide against it, because the medication story was still hanging in the air, because half the room still thought she was confused, because if she blurted out that this was Coraline's living son before the documents were on the table, my parents would twist it into proof that poor Grandma had finally lost the thread. So she did the hard thing. She swallowed it. She protected the truth by hiding it 1 more hour. She took the locket, closed his hand around it, and whispered. And later she told me what she said. She said, "You did nothing wrong, my love. Go on out with Aunt Vivian now, and when the grown-ups are done being foolish, I'll come find you and tell you a story about your mother. A story about your mother." To a 7-year-old, in a room full of people who'd been told his mother was a stranger's problem. Then Grandma straightened up, and she looked at me across the room. And I have never in my life seen a woman look so frightened and so ready at the same time. She gave me a nod, the same nod I'd give Theo an hour later. "It's fine. Keep walking." Except, from her to me, it meant something more. It meant, "I know now. I know what you've been protecting. And it's time," but she didn't say it. Not yet. She sat down in her chair at the head of the table, folded her shaking hands, and said to my father, "Go on, Gordon. Finish what you started. I want to hear all of it." And my father, God help him, thought that meant she was on his side. I need you to understand how thoroughly my parents had prepared to destroy me, because otherwise the rest of this won't make sense. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment accusation. This was a campaign. It started, as far as I can tell, about 3 months before the reunion, when my mother began telling people that Grandma had finally seen sense and updated her will to be fair to everyone. Fair. That's a word you should be suspicious of when it comes out of the mouth of someone who's about to take more than their share. Nobody says fair when the split is genuinely even. They say it when they're rehearsing a justification. The story my mother spread was simple and sympathetic. Poor Grandma Adele, getting on in years, had realized that her old will, some dusty thing from years ago, was outdated and didn't reflect the family as it is now. So she'd made a new one, a fairer one that, conveniently, put my father in control of everything. The house on Ridge Road, worth a good deal on its own, and the accounts, which together came to somewhere around $1.8 million. And in this new, fair will, I was written out, not reduced. Out. Because, and here's the elegant part, how could a thief inherit? A woman who'd stolen $100,000 from her own grandmother had disqualified herself, hadn't she? The theft accusation and the new will weren't two separate attacks. They were one machine. The accusation justified the will. The will proved the accusation. Round and round, each one holding the other up. I have to tell you how I even knew about the new will before the reunion, because it matters. It's the reason I walked into that dining room with an envelope instead of walking in blind. 3 weeks before the reunion, my grandmother called me. Not on her own phone. She used the landline at the neighbor's house, Mrs. Coltrane's, because she'd started to suspect, correctly, that her own phone was being watched. She was crying, which she almost never does. "They've had a lawyer here," she said. "Gordon's lawyer. They put papers in front of me after supper and told me it was to protect the house from the nursing home people. And I signed, Meredith, I signed a stack of them, and this morning I found a copy Gordon left on the desk. And it isn't about the nursing home at all. It says he decides everything. My money, my house, even whether I can see a doctor without him there." She'd signed a power of attorney, a durable one, the kind that doesn't go away, the kind that hands your whole life to another person's judgment. And she'd signed it in March, right after her fall, when the pain medication made the papers swim. I drove out that same night. I read the power of attorney at Mrs. Coltrane's kitchen table by the light over the stove, and my stomach turned, because it was worse than she thought. It didn't just give my father control of her finances. It gave him the authority to make decisions about her dependents and household members. Vague, sweeping language that a careless court might read as covering the little boy asleep upstairs. My parents hadn't just been reaching for the money. They'd been reaching for the authority to decide what happened to Theo. And a man who'd already filed to erase Coraline would not hesitate to move her son somewhere convenient. That was the night I understood this wasn't going to stay a paperwork fight. That was the night I stopped hoping I'd never have to open the envelope. There was just one problem for them, and my parents didn't know it was a problem, because they didn't know what I did for a living, the way I knew what I did for a living. I had notarized my grandmother's real will in 2020. I'd sat with Adele at her kitchen table, the two of us alone, and I'd walked her through every line the way I do with every client, making sure she understood, making sure no one was pressuring her, making sure she was of sound mind. I'd witnessed her signature. I'd arranged the second witness, a colleague from my office, with no stake in the family. And then, I'd done the thing that my parents, 3 years later, would fail to do. I'd filed it, registered it, lodged a sealed, dated copy with the Litchfield County Probate Court, where it sat in a vault with a case number, untouchable, unchangeable, waiting. That will named a primary beneficiary, and the primary beneficiary was not my father. It was my Aunt Coraline, and after her, Coraline's descendants. Her line came first. Everything else, including whatever my father hoped to scrape together, came after. So when my mother stood in the dining room 3 years later and announced that Grandma had made a new fair will, I knew 3 things instantly that nobody else in the room knew. 1. Any new will had to somehow deal with the registered one, or it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. 2. If this new will cut out Coraline's line, then somebody needed Coraline, and anyone who might inherit through her, to be legally gone. And 3. The distant cousin's charity case, lining his shoes up by the door, was Coraline's son. I didn't say any of that at the table. Not then. You don't fire your whole arsenal in the first minute of a battle you've waited 2 years to fight. But I did do one thing. When my mother finished her speech about the fair new will, I looked at my father and I asked in the mildest voice I own, "Can I see it?" He blinked. "See what?" "The new will," I said. "The fair one. You keep describing it. I'd like to read it. I do this for a living after all. Maybe I can confirm for everyone that it's valid." And there it was again. That flicker. The same one I'd seen when I reached into my bag. My father did not want me, of all people, reading that document. But 40 relatives were watching, and he'd just spent 10 minutes calling me a criminal. And a man who's just demanded transparency can't very well refuse it. Fine, he said, and he reached into a leather folio and drew out a document in a plastic sleeve and laid it on the table like he was laying down a winning card. Read it. Read the part where your grandmother left everything to the family that actually shows up for her. Read it out loud, Meredith, if you're so proud of what you do. I picked it up, and I want to tell you something about being a notary that you only learn after 11 years of it. You develop an eye. The way a jeweler can spot a fake diamond across a counter. The way a nurse can read a chart and know before the doctor says a word. I can pick up a document and know in about 4 seconds whether it was executed correctly. It's in the signatures, the seals, the witness block, the dates. A valid will has a specific architecture, and a will that's been faked or rushed or signed under pressure has a specific wrongness to it that shivers off the page. I held my grandmother's new fair will, and I felt the wrongness before I'd read a single clause. But I didn't say so. Not yet. Instead, I read it, slowly, out loud, exactly as my father had demanded. I read the part where everything went to Gordon Ansley. I read the part where the house on Ridge Road passed to him. I read the part where I, Meredith Ansley, was named specifically and cut out specifically in light of conduct unbecoming a beneficiary. The room ate it up. I could feel it. 40 people who'd wobbled a moment ago now firmed back up against me. There it was, in black and white, in Grandma's own will. Meredith the thief, written out by name. I set the document down. My father sat back, satisfied. "Thank you," I said. "That was very clear." I picked up my pen and wrote one word on my legal pad, and I turned it around so the cousins behind me could read it. The word was witnesses, because I'd read the whole thing out loud, every clause, and in the entire document, from the first line to the last, there had not been a single valid witness signature. Not one. Under Connecticut law, that isn't a technicality. That isn't a small thing you can fix later. A will without 2 proper witnesses isn't a weaker will. It isn't a will at all. But I didn't say that yet either. I just wrote the word, and I let it sit on the table between us like a lit match. And I asked my father the most dangerous question a calm person can ask a loud one. Who witnessed Grandma sign this? You could have heard a pin drop. And I want to be honest with you about how it felt in that pause, because this is the part people skip when they tell stories like this. The part where the villain is still winning. Standing there, I did not feel clever or safe. I felt the whole weight of the room pressing on me. 40 people who mostly still believed I was a thief. A father who had the authority and the volume and the highlighted stack of paper, and a phone in my mother's hand that she kept glancing at, like she was one tap from dialing the police. 'Cause that was the threat under everything, wasn't it? Confess, or we call the police. And a threat like that doesn't care whether you're innocent. Innocent people get arrested. Innocent people spend the night in a cell while the truth catches up. I knew my case was airtight, and I still felt my heart going like a fist on a door. Because knowing you're right and being believed are 2 different things, and in that moment I had one and not the other. My father felt me hesitate, and he pounced, the way he always does, on any silence. "See?" he said to the room, wheeling around, arms wide. "She's got a smart answer for the will, a smart answer for the code, a smart answer for everything, because that's what she does. That's her whole job. Twisting papers until nobody can tell up from down. But she can't answer the simple question: where is the money? He slammed his hand flat on the table with each word. $113,000 gone from a 79-year-old widow, and her granddaughter, the estate expert, wants to give a lecture about witnesses. He looked at my mother. Priscilla, I think we've been patient enough. Get the number for the sheriff. My mother lifted the phone, and that was the lowest point of the whole afternoon. Lower than the accusation, lower than the fake will. That was the moment I was closest to losing, because a phone was coming up, and 40 people were holding their breath, and the loud version of the story had never sounded more convincing. If I panicked, if I lunged, if I raised my voice to match his, I'd have handed them the frightened, cornered thief they'd advertised. So I did the hardest thing I did all day. I stayed still. I let her lift the phone, and I said very quietly, so quiet, the whole room had to go silent to hear me. Go ahead and call them, please, because the second a deputy walks in, everything on this table becomes part of a legal record, including the will you can't find witnesses for, and the reference code you won't read. You want law enforcement in this house. So do I. I'm the only person at this table who's been asking for the record all afternoon. Call them. My mother did not dial. Slowly, she set the phone back down. And in that small defeat, a threat raised and then quietly abandoned, the room read something it couldn't unread. The people threatening the police were the ones who didn't actually want the police to come. My father recovered fast. I'll give him that. He'd been ambushing people his whole life, and he knew how to take a hit and keep swinging. Witnesses, he repeated, buying time. Your mother was there. I was there. Your grandmother signed it in front of us, of her own free will. What more do you want? Under Connecticut law, I said, still mild, still writing, a will has to be signed by 2 witnesses. Now, a witness who stands to inherit doesn't automatically void the whole will. Under our law, they just forfeit whatever it left them. You inherit everything under this one. So does Mom. So even setting that aside, there's a simpler question underneath it. I'll ask again, and I'm asking because I genuinely want the answer, not to trap you. Who are the 2 witnesses who watched Grandma sign this document at all? I watched my father do the math. I watched him realize that every honest answer led somewhere bad. If he named 2 real people, I could call them, and they'd either deny it or crumble. If he admitted there were no witnesses, the will was dead on arrival. If he lied, he was committing a fresh crime in front of 40 people, one of whom was a notary, who'd just written the question down. You're twisting this, my mother cut in. You're using your little job to confuse everyone. Grandma made her wishes clear. Are you really going to stand there and argue with a dying woman's wishes? Grandma isn't dying, I said. She's sitting right there, and she can hear you calling her that. I turned to Adele. Grandma, did you sign this document? And for the first time, my grandmother spoke about the will directly. She looked at the plastic sleeve on the table like it was something that had crawled out of the wall. They put a lot of papers in front of me this spring, she said slowly. After my fall, when I was on the medication that made everything soft, Gordon would sit with me and say, sign here, Mother. It's just the insurance. Sign here. It's just the taxes. She pressed her lips together. I signed a great many things I didn't read. I trusted my son. Her voice cracked on the word, son. And it wasn't sadness in it. It was fury. the cold kind, the kind that's been waiting. The room made a sound, a low, collective intake of breath, because they'd all seen Grandma after her fall in March. They all knew about the medication. And now the picture my mother had painted, a lucid old woman, calmly updating her will to be fair, was cracking down the middle, and behind it was a different picture entirely. A frightened man, sliding papers under his mother's pen, while the drugs made the room go soft. Let me explain what I actually saw when I held that document, because this is the moment the whole afternoon turned, and I don't want you to take it on faith. I want you to understand it well enough that if it ever happens in your family, you'll know what to look for. A valid will in Connecticut needs three things, and they're not negotiable. It needs the person making it, the testator, to sign it, or to direct someone to sign for them in their presence. It needs two witnesses, and those witnesses have to actually watch the signing. And critically, they can't be people who inherit under the will. Because a person who gains from a document can't be trusted to swear it was signed freely. And while a will doesn't strictly require a notary in this state, a properly done one carries what's called a self-proving affidavit, a notarized statement from those witnesses that makes the will far harder to challenge later. That's the architecture. Signature. Two clean witnesses. Ideally, a notary sealing the whole thing shut. My grandmother's new fair will had a signature. A shaky one, made under medication, but a signature. And then it had nothing. No witness block at all. Where two disinterested people should have signed and dated, there was blank paper. Someone had typed up the terms my father wanted, printed it, gotten a drugged woman to sign it, and never bothered with the part that would have required finding two honest people willing to swear it was legitimate. Because there weren't two such people, because it wasn't. You have to understand what that means. It doesn't mean the new will is weaker than the old one, or that a judge would have to weigh them against each other. It means the new will was never a will. Legally, it was a piece of paper with my grandmother's name on it, and my father's wishes typed above the line. It had exactly as much power to move that estate as a grocery list. And here's where it flipped from a shield into a sword. My parents thought this document was the weapon that would write me out and hand them everything. But look at what it actually was. A paper that tried to redirect an entire estate away from its registered heir, prepared by the people who stood to gain, executed on a medicated woman with no valid witnesses, and produced at a family meeting alongside a brand new accusation of theft to explain why the registered heir's own daughter should be disqualified. Read that way, the only accurate way, it isn't an estate plan at all. It's a confession written in legal formatting. Every flaw I found wasn't just a reason the will would fail. It was evidence of what they'd been trying to do. So the document my father slapped on the table to bury me became, the second I understood it, the thing that would bury him. He'd handed me the murder weapon and asked me to admire it. That's the moment I stopped being a defendant. And here's a question I want you to sit with before I tell you the rest. Because everyone watching this has an opinion, and I genuinely want yours. What do you think my grandmother saw on that bank statement? At the very start, that made her stand up and send the children out of the room. Most people guess wrong. Tell me what you think it was before the reveal. I'll wait right here for you. I could have driven the knife in right there. I could have declared the will void and named my parents forgers in front of the whole family. I didn't. Because a good case, like a good story, isn't about the loudest reveal. It's about making the truth undeniable, one brick at a time, so that when the wall finally stands, no one can knock it down by shouting. My parents had built their case on volume. I was going to build mine on record. And a record needs one more thing before it's complete. It needs the money explained. So instead of finishing them, I picked the accusation back up, their accusation, and I handed it back to them by the sharp end. Let's go back to the theft, I said. Because you're right about one thing, Dad. There's money leaving Grandma's account every month, and everyone deserves to know where it goes. So let's find out. Together. Right now. And I reached into my bag again. Before I tell you what I took out, I have to tell you about my Aunt Coraline, because she's the ghost sitting at that table, and nothing that happened makes sense without her. Coraline Ansley was my grandmother's younger daughter, born in 1973. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who'd drive 4 hours to sit with you in a hospital waiting room. She was also, in the language my family used behind closed doors, difficult, which meant she saw through people, and she said what she saw, and she never learned to be quiet to keep the peace. My father hated her for it. My mother was afraid of her. And when Cora had a baby on her own in 2019 and refused to explain the circumstances to anyone's satisfaction, the family more or less decided she'd embarrassed them one time too many. Here's the part that took me 2 years to fully understand, so I'll say it plainly. In 2021, my parents filed a petition to have Coraline declared legally dead. She wasn't dead. In 2021, she was alive, raising her son, estranged from most of the family, but very much breathing. She'd moved out of state, gone quiet, stopped answering the calls from people who'd made it clear they didn't want her, and my parents used that silence as a weapon. They filed a presumption of death petition, the kind of thing meant for people who genuinely vanish, who go missing at sea, who disappear without a trace. And they built it on a scaffold of half-truths. No contact, no known address, presumed deceased. Why would you declare your own living sister-in-law dead? Because of the will. Because Coraline's line came first. As long as Coraline, or her son, existed in the eyes of the law, my father was second in line to $1.8 million. But erase Coraline on paper, and if her death predated any heir the court recognized, the whole line collapses, and everything slides down to the next name. To Gordon. They almost got away with it. The petition went through. On paper, in 2021, Coraline Ansley became deceased 3 years before she actually died, and then, in March of 2024, she actually did die. For real. A car accident on a rain-slick road 2 states away. And in the last weeks of her life, when she knew she was running out of time, my Aunt Coraline did the bravest thing I've ever known anyone to do. She didn't call the family that had erased her. She called her mother. She called Adele. And she said, "Mama, I have a son, and his name is Theo. And I need you to keep him safe. And here are the papers that prove who he is, because someday someone is going to try to pretend he's nobody." My grandmother drove through the night to reach her. She held her daughter's hand at the end, and she came home with a 4-year-old boy, a locket, a birth certificate, and a folder of documents proving that Theo was Coraline's son, which made him Adele's grandson, her direct descendant, and the rightful heir to Coraline's place at the front of that will. Standing, in other words, ahead of my father. Grandma couldn't announce any of that. Not with a fraudulent death certificate on file saying Coraline had died years before Theo could inherit through her. Not with my parents watching her every move, reading her mail, sliding papers under her pen. So she did the only thing a frightened grandmother could do. She hid the boy in plain sight, a distant cousin's charity case, and she started quietly providing for him the only way she safely could, $4,200 a month. Not stolen, not vanished. Support for a child, moving out of her account on a recurring transfer, tagged with a reference code that pointed back to a sealed provision she'd added to her estate file. A provision I had helped her draft and notarize a little over 2 years ago, when she first brought Theo home and finally told me everything. That was the night she took my hands and said, "Keep him safe, Meredith. Don't tell a soul until they force you. And if they ever force you, don't stop until it's finished." That's what my parents found in the bank statements. Not a theft. A grandmother taking care of a grandson they'd tried to legislate out of existence. They'd built their entire case. The accusation, the fake will, the family trial, on a foundation that, if anyone ever looked closely, would reveal the actual crime. And the actual crime wasn't mine. It was theirs. But knowing something and being able to prove it are two different countries. And I want to walk you through how I crossed from one to the other, because none of it fell into my lap. I earned every piece of paper in that envelope, and I want you to see the work, so that if you're ever the person nobody believes, you'll know it can be done. It started with the money. The same transfers my parents thought proved my guilt. The night I first saw one of those statements, months before the reunion, I did the one thing my father never did. I read the reference code. I pulled up my grandmother's records, the ones she'd authorized me to help her manage, and I traced that string of letters and numbers to its source. It wasn't a bank transfer to some anonymous account. It was a disbursement, tagged to a provision in her estate file. A seal provision she and I had drafted together, coded to a case reference so that even someone reading the statement couldn't tell who received it without the key. That was deliberate. She'd built the payments to be invisible on purpose to protect the boy. The $4,200 a month wasn't leaking out of her account. It was flowing exactly where she'd aimed it, on rails she and I had laid. The first loop closed right there in my own head, months early. The money was never missing. It was doing its job, but that only told me the money was support. It didn't tell me for whom, not in a way a court would accept. So I followed it down. The provision named a beneficiary, but the name was buried under a reference designation. And when I finally matched the designation to a person, the name that came up was one my parents had spent years trying to erase: Coraline Ansley, and after her, the issue of Coraline Ansley, her child. The support was flowing to Coraline's child, through my grandmother, quietly, month after month. And that's the thread that led me to the thing that made my hands go cold. Because when I searched the county records to confirm Coraline's status, a routine thing, I do it a dozen times a week for clients, the system told me Coraline Ansley was deceased, had been deceased since 2021. There was a filing, a presumption of death petition, granted, with my father's name on it as the petitioner. And I knew, because I had spoken to Coraline myself in 2022, that she had been alive a full year after the county said she was dead. I sat at my desk and read that petition 3 times, and the scale of it kept getting larger. This wasn't a squabble over a will. My parents had gone to a court and used sworn legal process to declare a living woman dead, to erase a person, and they'd done it in 2021, before Coraline actually died, before Theo could ever inherit through her, which meant it could only have been about the will, about clearing the lines so the estate would slide down to my father. I had the money. I had the buried name. I had the fraudulent death. What I didn't have, what I knew a court and a room full of skeptical relatives would demand, was hard proof that the little boy lining his shoes up by the door was actually Coraline's son, and not, as my parents would surely claim, some child anyone could hand a locket to. A locket is a keepsake. A birth certificate can be waved away as a piece of paper. I needed something no one could argue with. So 2 months before the reunion, I arranged a grandparent DNA test. I did it carefully and quietly. I explained to my grandmother why it mattered, and she agreed. And we did a simple cheek swab from her and one from Theo, through an accredited lab that does exactly this kind of testing for courts every single day. When a parent is gone, you can still establish a child's bloodline by comparing them to a grandparent, and the science is boring and rock solid and full of decimal places. I ordered it myself. I paid for it myself. And when the certified result came back confirming, to a probability with a long tail of nines, that Theo was Adele Ansley's biological grandson through Coraline, I sealed it in the envelope with the will and the petition, and I waited, because I still hoped I'd never have to use it. That's the work. Nobody handed me a smoking gun. I read a code my father wouldn't read, followed it to a name my parents had buried, found the fraud underneath it, and then went and got the science to nail it shut. By the time I walked into that reunion, I wasn't hoping to win an argument. I was carrying a case. So, back to the table, back to my hand reaching into my bag. But I didn't take out the envelope, not yet. I took out my phone. "Dad, you have Grandma's bank statements," I said. "Real ones from the bank, with the reference codes on them. I'm going to trust that they're genuine because you brought them to accuse me. So let's use them." "Grandma," I turned to her, "would you be willing to log into your account right now on your own phone and read us what these transfers actually are? Not what anyone says they are. What the bank says they are." My father shot up half out of his chair. "That's not necessary." "It's extremely necessary," I said. "You've accused me of draining her account. The fastest way to prove it is to look at the account, unless there's a reason you don't want her to look." And that line, "unless there's a reason you don't want her to look," went around the room like a current, because it's unanswerable. Every objection he raised now sounded like a man trying to keep a door shut. My grandmother already had her phone out. Of course she did. She'd asked for her reading glasses 15 minutes ago, and while my parents thought she was following along with their trial, she'd been quietly logging in. That's what she'd read at the very start that made her stand up and send the children out. She'd pulled up her own account, and she'd seen the reference code my father wouldn't read, and being Adele Ansley, she'd tapped it. And the account had shown her exactly where $4,200 went every month, and under what provision, and in whose name. She'd seen her dead daughter's name attached to a living child's support. That's what she read at the head of the table. That's why she stood up. That's why she looked at Theo and said, "Take the children outside, now, before I say the rest." She wasn't protecting the family from the boy. She was protecting the boy from the family. "I've already looked," Grandma said now, quietly, and the whole room turned to her. She held up her phone, though no one could see the screen. "I looked while my son was calling my granddaughter a thief. Would you like to know what the money is, Gordon? Since you've had 2 years to wonder and never once asked me." My father's face had gone the color of putty. "Mother, you're confused." "I am not confused." Her voice cut clean across his. I set that money up. Every dollar. It goes where I sent it for a purpose I chose, and Meredith didn't take a cent of it. She helped me arrange it, because she's the only person in this family who ever helped me do anything without asking what was in it for her. She set the phone down. Now, I could tell all of you where that money goes, but some of you don't deserve to hear it from me. And one of you, she looked at my father, is going to explain something to this family first. But before she got to that, I wanted the room to see the money for itself. Not take her word, not take mine. So I picked up the top statement, the one my father had highlighted, and I held it where the cousins behind me could see. Here's the reference code my father wouldn't read, I said. And I read it aloud, the whole string, slowly, letter by letter. It meant nothing to them as sound. That's the point. On its own, it's gibberish, like he said. But it's not on its own. It's a key. Grandma, on your phone, if you tap into the transaction and open the detail, does it show you what this code points to? It does, she said. It's been showing me for 20 minutes. She held the phone up, and though no one could read the small screen, everyone could see her scrolling. It says the transfer is a scheduled disbursement under a provision of my estate to a beneficiary. She looked up. It has a name on it. The name is why I stood up. Read it if you can, Grandma, I said. Or I will, because the whole family's been told for 2 years that this money vanished. It didn't vanish. It has a destination, and the destination is printed right there in the bank's own records. Not mine, not Grandma's, the bank's. Every person here can pull up their own account tonight and see that transfers, like this, always carry a code. And the code always points somewhere. Nothing disappears. It only goes where someone sends it. Dad's been asking who has the knowledge to move money, so it can't be traced. I set the statement down. But it was traced. I traced it. It took about 5 minutes, and it led to a name my father has spent 5 years trying to make sure none of you would ever hear. The room was dead quiet now. Even Bennett had stopped fidgeting, because they could feel it. The 2-year mystery, the thing they'd all been whispering about, was about to have an answer, and the answer wasn't the one they'd been sold. And that's when my grandmother turned those old, clear eyes on my father, and the whole room leaned in. Gordon, where is your sister? The question landed like a stone in still water. Where is Coraline? My father opened his mouth, closed it. My mother's hand found his arm, and 40 relatives who had come to watch me confess slowly began to realize they were at the wrong trial. Cora's gone, Mother, my father said carefully. You know that. She passed. When? Grandma asked. Years ago, you know this. We grieved. When, Gordon? Give me the year. And here my father made the mistake that people make when they've told a lie so many times they've forgotten which version they filed. I don't. It was 2021. We lost touch. And then, 2021, my grandmother repeated. You're certain. You'll say that in front of everyone. Coraline died in 2021. Yes, he said. Because he'd committed now, because the whole fake will and the whole theft story depended on Cora being gone before her son could inherit. Yes, Mother. 2021. My grandmother closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was steel. My daughter died in March of 2024, she said. In a hospital, 2 states away, holding my hand. I drove 11 hours to be with her. She was alive in 2021 and 2022 and 2023, and you knew it, because I told you at Christmas that I'd spoken to her, and you told me I was imagining things. You told me I was getting confused. Her voice rose. just once, and then dropped back to that terrible calm. You had your own sister declared dead while she was alive, Gordon. I've seen the filing. Meredith found it. You did it in 2021 so that when the will was read, her line would already be gone. The room erupted. Not in shouting, in that awful low roar of 40 people all turning to their neighbor at once, all saying no, and did you hear? And that can't be. My mother was on her feet now, saying my grandmother's name, saying she's not well. She's been confused since the fall. Don't listen. Running the same play she'd run all afternoon. The play where the old woman is too frail to be believed. But it doesn't work twice. Not after everyone's just watched that same confused old woman log into her own bank account and lay out a 2-year mystery in 30 seconds. And then, my father did the thing that cornered animals do. He stopped defending, and he attacked the one thing he thought I couldn't protect. He stood, and his voice came back. And it was ugly now, stripped of the courtroom polish. You want to talk about that boy? He said. Fine. Let's talk about him. That child has no business in this house. Nobody knows where he came from. Nobody vetted the situation. And my mother is a 79-year-old woman who is clearly not competent to be raising a 7-year-old. He turned to the room, spreading his hands, reasonable, concerned, a good son worried about his mother. I have power of attorney, signed, legal, in my desk, which means the decisions about this household, including about that child, are mine to make. And I'm telling all of you, as the person legally responsible, that first thing Monday, I'm calling the agencies to have that boy placed somewhere appropriate while we sort out what's really going on here. The room went cold, because said like that, worried son, incompetent mother, unvetted child, it sounded almost responsible. And I watched my mother nod along, and I understood this was the real plan all along, the end game under the end game. Discredit me, seize control through the power of attorney, and then move Theo out of reach before anyone could prove who he was. If the boy was gone, placed, relocated, lost in a system, then the DNA test and the will and all of it became a fight over an heir no one could find. They weren't just trying to steal an estate. They were trying to make a child disappear, the same way they'd made his mother disappear, on paper, through official channels, so it would look like procedure instead of theft. That was the moment the stakes stopped being about money. A 7-year-old was counting maple leaves in the backyard, and his uncle had just announced a timeline for taking him away. My grandmother started to rise furious, and I put my hand on her shoulder and eased her back down because this one was mine to answer, and I needed to answer it cold. I stood up. I'd been sitting the whole time, taking notes, letting them dig. Now I stood, and the room quieted, because I hadn't raised my voice once all afternoon, and people had started to notice that the quiet person was the one who kept turning out to be right. You're not calling anyone Monday, I said to my father, and I'm going to tell you why, in front of everyone, so there's no confusion later. You keep waving that power of attorney around like it's a crown. Let's look at it. Grandma signed it in March, after her fall, while she was on medication that she'll testify and her doctor will confirm, left her unable to understand what she was signing. A power of attorney, signed by someone who lacks the capacity to understand. It isn't valid. It's void, just like the will. You've built your whole authority in this house on 2 documents you got an incapacitated woman to sign, and neither one of them can survive 10 minutes of scrutiny. I let that land. So you have no legal authority over Grandma's finances, her home, or anyone living in it. And you certainly have no authority over that little boy, because that little boy is not an unvetted stranger. He is the registered heir to this estate, and I can prove his identity to a court tomorrow morning. If you so much as pick up the phone to have him moved, you won't be exercising authority. You'll be attempting to remove a child who stands between you and $1.8 million right after being caught faking his mother's death to clear the same path. Think very hard about how that reads to a judge. My father didn't have an answer. Neither did my mother, and I watched the last of their power drain out of the room because I'd just taken away the one weapon they'd been saving, the paper that let them act like they were in charge. Without it, they were just two people making accusations at a table, and the table had stopped believing them an hour ago. That's when I decided it was time to stop dismantling their case and start proving mine. I'm going to make this simple, I said. Everything my grandmother just told you can be proven with documents. Not memory. Not he said, she said. Paper, filed with courts, dated, sealed. And I happened to have brought the paper. And then finally I reached into my bag and took out the sealed envelope. I held it up so the whole room could see it was sealed. Actually sealed, with my notary stamp pressed into wax over the flap, the date embossed beneath it. 2 months old, untouched. This is a certified copy of my grandmother's real will, I said. The one she signed in 2020 in front of 2 proper, disinterested witnesses when she was of completely sound mind. I notarized it myself. The original is registered and sealed at the Litchfield County Probate Court under a case number I can give you right now. I read the number aloud, slowly, and I watched my father flinch at each digit, because he knew, he'd always known, that somewhere in a courthouse there was a document he couldn't reach. It has been sitting in that vault for 6 years. It cannot be altered. It cannot be replaced by a paper someone slid under a medicated woman's pen this spring. And when it's opened, it will name Coraline Ansley and Coraline's descendants as the primary beneficiaries of this estate. Ahead of everyone. Ahead of my father. I set the envelope on the table next to the fake will, the 2 documents side by side, and I let everyone look at them. One sealed, stamped, dated, filed with a court. One in a plastic sleeve with no valid witnesses, and a fresh accusation baked into it as an excuse. You don't have to take my word for any of this, I said. That's the whole point. You never have to take anyone's word for anything, if the paper exists. So here's what I'd ask you to do, all of you, before you decide who to believe in this room. Don't believe me, don't believe them. Believe the court. The real will is on file. The presumption of death petition is on file. The bank's records are on Grandma's phone. Every single claim I've made today can be checked by a stranger who's never met this family. And if you're listening to all of this and wondering where you'd have drawn the line, whether you'd have signed those papers for your mother, whether you'd have looked the other way at a reunion because it was easier, I honestly want to know. Because I think most people tell themselves they'd never do what my parents did. And most people are wrong about that, right up until the money's on the table. Nobody spoke. And into that silence, I opened the envelope. Let me slow down here, because this is the part where everything my parents had built came down, and I don't want you to miss how it fell. Not with a shout, but with a signature. I broke the wax seal. I slid out the certified copy, and I did not read the whole thing, because a will is long and boring, and the room didn't need the boring parts. I read 3 lines. I read the line that named Coraline Ansley and her descendants as primary beneficiaries. I read the line that specified, in my grandmother's careful language, that should Coraline predecease her, Coraline's issue, her children, would inherit her entire share per stirpes, meaning it passed straight down her bloodline and could not be diverted. And I read the date, 2020, signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed a full year before my father petitioned to have his sister declared dead. Then I reached into the envelope and drew out the second document, and I laid it beside the will, and this was the one that turned the whole afternoon from a family argument into something with a courthouse at the end of it. This, I said, is the petition my father filed in 2021. It asks a court to declare Coraline Ansley legally dead. It's signed by him. It's dated. It's a public record. Any of you can pull it up on your phone right now, and I'd like you to, because I don't want you taking my word for a single thing today. I read the case number aloud, the way I'd read the wills, slow and clear, and I watched 3 or 4 cousins actually type it into their phones. Here's what I need you to understand about the dates, because the dates are the whole crime. This petition says Coraline was gone in 2021, but Coraline did not die until March of 2024. Grandma was with her. So the question isn't whether my father made a mistake about a date. The question is why a man would go to a court and swear his living sister was dead 3 years before she actually died. I looked around the room and I answered my own question because I wanted it said plainly in front of everyone so no one could soften it later. He did it because of the order. The real will, this one, sealed, registered, puts Coraline's line first. So as long as Coraline or any child of hers existed in the eyes of the law, my father was second, not first. Second, behind a sister he despised, and a nephew he pretended didn't exist. But erase Coraline early enough, before any heir of hers could be recognized, and the whole line collapses, and everything slides down to the next name. I put my finger on his name in the will. This name, Gordon Ansley. My parents didn't fake a death out of grief or confusion. They faked it to move themselves to the front of a line worth $1.8 million. The theft they accused me of was the exact thing they were doing themselves, except I moved money to protect a child, and they moved a court to erase one. The phones were coming up all around the table now. I could see the little glow of them, cousin after cousin, pulling up the public record, and I heard the small sounds people make when a thing they were told was impossible turns out to be right there in front of them, filed, stamped, real. My mother said, "That's out of context," and nobody even turned to look at her. Context is what you ask for when the plain reading is fatal. Then I set it down, and I said the sentence I'd been carrying for 2 years. Coraline had a son. His name is Theo. He's 7 years old, and he's sitting in the backyard right now with Aunt Vivian, holding his mother's locket. He is Coraline's child, which makes him Grandma's grandson, which makes him, according to this will, the real one, the registered one, the heir to Coraline's entire share of this estate, standing ahead of my father, which is exactly why my father needed Coraline dead on paper before Theo could inherit through her. It was never about me stealing money. There was no stolen money. It was about a little boy my parents needed the law to pretend didn't exist. The silence after that was the loudest thing I've ever heard. My father found his voice first, and it came out cracked. "You can't prove that boy is Cora's. Anyone can hand a child a locket. You have no—" "I have a DNA test," I said. I took the last document out of the envelope. I arranged a grandparent DNA comparison 2 months ago between Theo and Grandma Adele. It's a standard test. Courts accept it every day to establish exactly this kind of relationship when a parent is deceased. It's certified. It's here. I held it up. It confirms, to a probability I won't bore you with, because it has a lot of nines in it, that Theo is the biological grandson of Adele Ansley through her daughter Coraline. He is who I say he is. He is who Grandma says he is. And no amount of shouting in this dining room changes what's written on this page. My mother tried one more time. I have to give her credit for stamina, if nothing else. Tests can be wrong, she said. Labs make mistakes. This proves nothing. But it was the sound of someone throwing furniture in front of a door that's already open. She was arguing with a certified document held by a notary in a room where every other thing she'd said that day had already come apart. And this time, nobody nodded along. This time, my great-uncle Walter, 91 and half deaf, said into the silence, loud as a bell, "So the boy's Cora's, and you two told everybody Cora was dead years back." He looked around the table, genuinely confused, saying the plain thing that no one else would say. "Well, which is it? You can't have a dead woman with a living son and a will that skips him unless somebody arranged it that way." And that, a 91-year-old man, stating the obvious he couldn't hear well enough to be tactful about, did more than any speech of mine, because he just said out loud the shape of the whole thing, and once a room hears the shape, it can't unhear it. I watched it move across the faces, like a tide going out. The aunts who'd come ready to comfort my grieving parents. The cousins who'd wanted to be on the winning team. Bennett, who'd cheered for whoever was ahead. One by one, they did the arithmetic Walter had laid bare. Dead sister, living nephew, faked death, redirected will, a notary daughter accused of theft the same month the fake will appeared. And one by one they arrived at the only answer that fit all the facts at once. Not the loud answer, the true one. Nobody defended my parents after that. Not one person. My mother kept talking to a room that had turned its back, and the sound of it got smaller and smaller until it was just words falling into a space where nobody was listening anymore. That's what losing looks like in the end. Not a dramatic collapse, just the slow, total silence of a room that has finished believing you. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question, not a rhetorical one. My grandmother said later that the thing that broke her heart wasn't the fraud. It was that 40 people almost let it happen because the accusation was loud and the truth was quiet, and it's so much easier to believe the confident voice than to ask for the document. So here's what I want to know from you. In that room, before the envelope came out, which one would you have believed? The father with 40 years of authority and a stack of highlighted statements, or the daughter who wouldn't defend herself and just kept taking notes? Be honest with yourself. I think the honest answer is what this whole story is actually about. My father did not confess. I want to be honest with you about that, because in the movies, this is where the villain breaks down and admits everything, and real life doesn't work that way. Real life is quieter and worse. My father didn't confess. He just stopped. He looked at the DNA report and the sealed will and the bank record on his mother's phone and the 40 faces around the room that had turned, one by one, away from him, and something went out of him. He sat down. My mother kept talking, kept trying to run the plays. Don't listen. She's confused. This is all a misunderstanding. But she was performing to an empty theater now. Nobody was watching her. They were reading the papers on the table, passing them hand to hand, and paper doesn't get louder or quieter. It just says what it says. My brother Desmond was the one who broke the family's silence, and I'll admit, I didn't see it coming. Desmond had been on their side the whole time. He stood to inherit under the fake will too, a nice slice for the loyal son. But Desmond stood up, looked at our parents for a long moment, and then walked around the table and stood next to me. He didn't say anything noble. He just said, I want to see the court file, the real one. If it says what she says, it says, I'm done. And he took out his phone and started looking it up, right there, and when it loaded, when the case number I'd read aloud pulled up a real sealed registration dated 2020, he set the phone down very carefully, like it might break, and he didn't look at our parents again. That's how it ended, if you want to call it an ending. Not with a confession, with a family fact-checking its patriarch in real time and finding him wanting. My grandmother had the last word at that table, and it wasn't for my parents, it was for the room. She stood up again. She needed the table to do it, and she looked around at all those faces, some ashamed, some stunned, some still not sure what they just watched. I want to say one thing, and then I want everyone who isn't my son or his wife to please go home and think about what almost happened here, she said. My daughter Coraline was not difficult. She was honest, and this family punished her for it. And when she needed us, we had already declared her dead. I will carry that for the rest of my life. But her son is alive. He's in my backyard. And every one of you had the chance today to look at a sealed court document instead of listening to the loudest voice in the room. And I want you to remember which one told you the truth. She looked at me. My granddaughter has spent 2 years being called a thief so she could protect a 7-year-old boy without tipping off the people who wanted him gone. She let you all believe the worst of her rather than risk his safety. That is the opposite of what she was accused of. I'd like someone to remember that too. And then she sat down, and she was tired in a way I'd never seen, and I went and stood behind her chair with my hand on her shoulder, and that's how the reunion ended. The days after were not clean. Real consequences never are. Let me tell you where things landed, because I think you've earned the ending. The presumption of death petition on Coraline was challenged and vacated. That part was almost easy, in a grim way. It's not hard to prove a woman was alive when you have hospital records dated 3 years after she was supposedly declared dead. Once the court saw that, it didn't just correct the record. It started asking how a false petition got filed in the first place, and who benefited, and whether anyone had knowingly submitted false information to a court. Those are not small questions. My father is answering them now, with a lawyer, and it is costing him a great deal more than the money he thought he was going to inherit. I want to be precise about this, because people hear consequences and imagine handcuffs and a courtroom drama, and that's not usually how it goes. What actually happened is slower and, in its way, heavier. When you file a false statement with a probate court, when you swear to obtain a legal outcome that a living person is dead, you don't just lose the thing you were trying to gain. You open yourself to civil liability, to everyone you harmed, and you invite the kind of scrutiny that follows a person for years. The estate my father tried to seize is now the subject of a formal review. Every transaction he touched under that power of attorney is being examined. The lawyer he hired isn't there to help him inherit anymore. He's there to keep my father from losing far more than he ever stood to gain. My parents put their retirement, their own house, and their name in the community on the table to reach for $1.8 million, and the reaching is what's going to cost them everything. The family split the way families do, quietly, in the weeks after, over phone calls and unreturned texts rather than any dramatic scene. Some relatives called me to apologize, which I appreciated, and which I noticed had not happened until after the documents proved me right. Forgiveness is easy to offer once the risk is gone. Some went silent, embarrassed to have been so ready to convict me, and a few, the ones I'll actually keep, simply showed up. My cousin Bennett, of all people, drove out to Ridge Road 2 weekends running to fix Grandma's porch step and play catch with Theo in the yard, and he never once mentioned the reunion, which was his way of saying he was sorry. Great Uncle Walter tells the story now at every gathering, louder each time, always ending with the same line. And the quiet one had it all in an envelope the whole time. He makes it sound like a folk tale. Maybe it is one. Desmond and I are rebuilding, slowly. It matters to me that when he turned on the strength of a court record. He looked up himself, not because I begged him to. He didn't take my side. He took the truth side and found me standing on it. That's a brother I can work with. He's the one who drives Theo to school 2 mornings a week now, and the two of them have an ongoing argument about baseball teams that I hope never gets resolved. The fake will was never going to survive. A will with no valid witnesses isn't weak. It's nothing. But it turned out to be worse than nothing for my parents, because a document that tries to write out the true heir, drafted by the same people who'd faked a death to clear the path, doesn't read like an estate plan. It reads like evidence. The very paper my father laid on the table to destroy me became one of the clearest exhibits of what he'd been trying to do. The power of attorney my parents had pressured Grandma into signing after her fall, the one that let them slide all those papers under her pen, was revoked the following week in my office with 2 clean witnesses and a doctor's letter confirming she was of sound mind, which she has always obviously been. My parents lost their control over her accounts and her house that same day. And Theo is the reason any of this happened. So let me tell you about Theo. I set up a protective trust for him. It's the thing I know how to do. The thing I do for other families every week. And for once, I got to do it for my own. The trust secures Coraline's share of the estate for Theo, holds it safe until he's grown, and, this part mattered most to me, protects his identity and his story until he's old enough to decide for himself who gets to know it. No more distant cousin's charity case. No more hiding him in plain sight. But no putting a 7-year-old's whole tragic history on display for a family that hadn't earned it either. When he's older, he'll have every document, the locket, the birth certificate, the DNA report, the will, and a letter from his grandmother, and he'll get to decide what to do with all of it. That's his right. I just made sure no one could take it from him first. He lives with Grandma Adele on Ridge Road now, officially, permanently. He still lines his shoes up by the door, toes even. He still won't let anyone see the photo inside the locket. Some nights I stay over, and I hear the 2 of them in the kitchen, a 79-year-old woman and a 7-year-old boy, and she's teaching him to make his mother's biscuit recipe, telling him stories about Cora, keeping his mother alive for him the only way any of us can keep the dead alive, which is out loud, on purpose, refusing to let them be erased a second time. As for my parents, people always want to know if I forgave them, if there was some big reconciliation, some tearful holiday where we all decided family is family. There wasn't. I want to be honest about that because I think the pressure to reconcile is its own kind of trap. The same pressure that told Coraline to be quiet and keep the peace. I drew a boundary instead. I told my parents once calmly, in writing, that I would not be pursuing a relationship with them, that Theo would be protected from them, and that if they had anything to say to me, they could say it through lawyers, since that's the language they'd chosen. I didn't scream it. I didn't need to. I've learned that the quietest sentence in the room is often the one that finally gets heard. And I only had to say that one once. I keep thinking about the moment at the table, before any of it came out, when my father tapped that stack of statements and told 40 people I was a criminal. He was so sure. He had 2 years of preparation and 40 witnesses and the loudest voice in the house. And he lost to a sealed envelope and an old woman with her reading glasses. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be written down and kept safe and brought out at the right moment by someone patient enough to wait. My Aunt Coraline waited her whole life to be believed. She didn't get to see it happen. But her son will grow up knowing exactly who his mother was, exactly what she survived, and exactly what it cost to keep him safe. And no one, ever again, is going to stand in a dining room and try to say he doesn't exist. That's worth 2 years of being called a thief. It's worth a lot more than that. Grandma keeps the sealed envelope now, the empty one, with the broken wax stamp. She has it framed on the mantel on Ridge Road next to a photo of Coraline. When people ask about it, and they do, it's an odd thing to frame. She just smiles and says, "That's the day the quiet one finally spoke." And Theo, if he's in the room, lines his shoes up by the door and doesn't say anything at all, because he's learning from the two of us that the strongest thing you can do is wait and keep the proof and never let anyone tell you you're nobody. Keep your proof wherever you are. Keep it sealed, keep it safe, and know exactly where the line is before anyone tries to move it. Because someday, the loudest person in the room is going to point across the table at you. And when they do, you won't need to shout. You'll just need to reach into your bag,